Hi class, welcome to Chapter 8, Energy Balance and Body Composition. So we will jump right in, and energy balance is a lot like what it sounds like and what is depicted in this picture at the bottom. So the picture at the bottom is meant to represent a scale, and if scales are even, meaning there's a horizontal line on the balance, then there is equality. And so energy balance is where energy consumed in the form of calories is equal to energy expended, also in the form of calories. And when energy consumed is equal to energy expended, body weight should stay the same. We've already learned that if we consume excess energy, it generally leads to weight gain and fat storage. And if we don't consume enough energy, it can lead to weight loss and malnutrition. I did put these asterisks here because sometimes the relationship is not 100% this clear. And so sometimes there's a slight calorie imbalance and people perhaps gain more weight than would be expected based on the energy relationship, or people lose more weight than would be expended based on the energy relationship. So we're going to dive into that in more details. So how many calories are contained in 1 pound of body fat? You may have read in your book, but approximately 3,500 calories are contained in 1 pound of body fat. So if you divide 3,500 calories by 7 days of the week, you find that that equals 500 calories per day. And so with this kind of an equation, you could estimate that if you were to consume an additional 500 calories per day for an entire week, that would lead to 3,500 calories total, and that could cause 1 pound of weight gain. On the flip side of that, the equation states that if you consume 500 calories less every day for an entire week, you could lose a pound of weight. So as far as the numbers go, that is equal and that equation works out. However, there are many more factors that go into energy balance besides just these numbers. And so unfortunately, often when people do cut back calories, instead of them losing weight in a linear fashion as we would expect, their weight loss tends to slow down. And this is because their metabolic rate actually can change. And so metabolic rate is the biggest contributor to energy expenditure. And if metabolic rate reduces, then that means 2/3 of this person's energy expenditure is actually lower than we would expect, and they're not burning that many calories. So weight loss, while with the numbers should be very simple, it's actually much more complicated. And there are more factors that go into this complicated scenario as well, as I'm sure anybody who's ever tried a diet or who's tried to lose weight before can attest to. So what does this look like? So body fat is very kind of large, where muscle is considered more dense. So from a spatial standpoint, 1 pound of fat is almost twice as big as 1 pound of muscle. And fat is primarily made up of fat. You do see in this picture some red speckling, and so that's vascularization or blood supply going to the fat. So that's an additional component of fat. You also have the fat cell walls, which are going to be lipoprotein based for the most part. And then muscle is primarily made out of protein and fibers, and muscle can carry a decent amount of water. So people who are very muscular tend to be very kind of compact, and they may weigh as much as somebody who's bigger but less muscular and composed of more body fat. What is a safe rate of weight loss? A safe rate of weight loss is actually a very slow weight loss. And the reason that a slow weight loss is recommended is because a slow weight loss will not change your metabolic rate as rapidly as a quick weight loss. When you lose weight too quickly, your body feels that it's going into starvation mode, and it clamps down on its metabolic expenditure, therefore burning way fewer calories. Because really humans were adapted to live in times of famines, but we don't experience famines anymore. And so this can be a problem. When you lose weight gradually, it's likely due to small and sustained lifestyle changes. And so it tends to be longer lasting and more achievable. Weight gain and weight loss. So when we gain weight, or lose weight, we tend to gain or lose primarily fat, 75%, and a small portion of muscle, about 25%. If somebody is a bodybuilder and performing specific activities as well as eating specific dietary patterns that may boost lean muscle mass, they may be gaining a much higher percent of lean muscle versus fat than the average person who has gained weight. If somebody is in a starvation situation, we end up having to break down our muscles as a source of energy. So in starvation situations, we lose a higher percentage of our lean body mass. So when we're talking about energy balance, I said energy balance is equivalent to the energy in, or the calories in, versus the calories out. And for humans, we get all of our calories from food and beverages. So hopefully you remember that in each macronutrient or non-nutrient, such as alcohol, there's a variable amount of calories. For example, 1 gram of carbohydrate provides 4 calories, 1 gram of protein provides 4 calories, 1 gram of fat provides 9 calories, and 1 gram of alcohol provides 7 calories. How do scientists find out how many calories there are in foods? Well, they actually can put the food into a small chamber, which is pictured here. This chamber is called a bomb calorimeter, and what they'll do is they'll heat the food up until it combusts or burns, and as that food burns, it releases energy in the form of heat. That energy heats the water surrounding this chamber, and inside the water is a long thermometer, which can measure the change in temperature of the water based on the energy released as the food is burned. And so we reviewed this already, but this is called a bomb calorimeter. And when establishing caloric content of new foods, often a bomb calorimeter will be used. Going back to the previous slide, if we know how many carbs, protein, fat, or grams of alcohol are in a food, we can use the established values such as 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, 4 calories per gram protein, etc., to calculate how many calories total will be in a food. So we kind of have 2 options for determining caloric intake of different foods that we eat. What influences our food intake? So many things besides just these here, but these are some of the physiological, meaning bodily influences on food intake. And so we're going to talk about all of them coming up in more detail. You should definitely be familiar with the different influencers on food intake. And the first one we're going to discuss is appetite. I'm sure you're familiar with appetite. Maybe you feel that you often have a good appetite. Maybe around the holidays you have a great appetite. Maybe if you smell fresh baking bread or fresh cookies, or for me, when I smell Cinnabon or cinnamon rolls, I want them. I'm immediately hungry no matter what I have already eaten. And so appetite can be stimulated by seeing foods, by thinking of foods. Maybe you've watched a commercial on TV where they've shown a mouth-watering food and all of a sudden you feel that you're hungry. Even talking about foods. So appetite includes these types of stimulus and sensations. Hunger. Hunger is a physiological response to the need of food. And so what happens when we have not eaten in a long time and there's no food in our stomach is our stomach shrinks and multiple hormones are released that act upon the hypothalamus, which is a small segment of our brain, and cause the hypothalamus to send signals to our brain that we're hungry. And so these are nerve signals that can trigger hunger. There are multiple different things that can trigger hunger, such as food in the stomach, like I already mentioned. Also nutrients in the bloodstream. So if you have low glucose levels, you may feel hungry because your cells are starving. How big your last meal was, the weather. Sometimes cold weather increases appetite, hot weather decreases appetite, but that's not necessarily universal. Physical activity, you can work up an appetite and work up hunger per se. Be hungry because you just did a big workout. And hormones also play a role in hunger. So hunger is a physiological response to not having enough food. Satiation. So satiation is the feeling of satisfaction and fullness that occurs during a meal and causes you to stop eating. So satiation is what tells you stop eating. So you're at the buffet, you're eating, you're going back for more, seconds, thirds, fourths, and then you go get some fifth portion of the food and you say, no, I just can't. I am too full. That's satiation. So your fullness, literally the physical size of your stomach, can expand. And as your stomach stretches, receptors are triggered that send chemical messengers to the brain that tells you to stop eating. There are also hormones involved in satiation, and one of the hormones is called CCK. So satiation tells us to stop eating. Satiety is similar to satiation, but instead of telling us to stop eating, satiety tells us that we are still full. So perhaps we have just previously eaten a meal about an hour ago, and then we go out to a friend's house and they offer us some snack. Satiety is a component of our physiological response that will make us say, oh, no, thank you. I'm not hungry. I've already eaten. I'm still full. And so satiety can be a good mechanism to determine how much time will pass between meals. If you ate a very satiating meal, it's more likely that the time between meals is going to be longer, meaning you're going to continue to feel full and not want to eat again as soon. If you eat a meal that was not very satiating, which we're going to talk about components of meals that contribute to satiety, but if you eat a low satiety meal, time may pass rather quickly, and it may be only an hour after your last meal before you feel like you need another snack. So these are some of the physiological cues involved in eating and feeling full or satiated. It is possible for us to override these physiological cues, and we have many internal as well as external cues that cause us to eat, want food, not want food, etc. So these are just some listed here, but when you're bored, many people eat when they're bored, if they're sitting in front of the TV or sitting at a computer screen while driving. Some people eat when they're sad. Some people don't feel like eating when they're sad. I know when I'm sad, a big bowl of ice cream or a nice macaroni and cheese dish always makes me, in my mind at least, feel better. But that's just me. Excitement can be an external cue. So perhaps you're at a celebration or a birthday party, you're celebrating, you're excited, you're going to have birthday cake and ice cream, even though you're not particularly hungry for it, but you're going to have it because it's exciting. Maybe you're having champagne, that's exciting to celebrate a success or a promotion. External cues, I talked about TV commercials. Maybe you're watching a Carl's Jr. commercial for one of those burgers that drips all over the place, and all of a sudden you're craving a burger. Maybe you're watching your watch. So I'm kind of a clock watcher. When it turns 11 or 12 o'clock in the afternoon, I know it is lunchtime for me, or I at least tell myself it's lunchtime, whether or not I actually feel deep hunger at that time. I'm a big kind of clock-driven person. Other things, foods offered by friends or family. Many cultures, many people feel that it's rude to turn down food. So often you will eat food offered by a friend or family member or during an occasion, even if you weren't necessarily hungry or even if you were already full. This one is funny. Even though I'm full, I'll have some pie. We call this the second stomach phenomenon. And this is because when you're a kid, it's very easy to have your first stomach or your real stomach get full of all your veggies and your mashed potatoes and your protein foods and your milk. But then anytime parents or anybody else offers dessert, somehow you miraculously have room. And we call that room the second stomach. So it's very rare that people will be too full to eat dessert, and it's kind of called the second stomach phenomenon. This is hunger, satiation, and satiety, and different things that influence kind of each component. So you can look over this on your own. But as far as hunger goes, gastric contractions, maybe you guys have felt that your stomach was turning. Maybe you've even heard your stomach turning. Hormones, endorphins, the fact that your stomach is empty, maybe you feel hollow inside. Sensory influences can cause you to start looking for food. So again, you're walking by the Cinnabon in the airport or the mall, and all of a sudden you crave one and you want to eat one and you feel hungry. You didn't even know you were. Cognitive influences, so these can be peer situations, social situations, time of day, my watch, maybe there's a lot of food available, you're at a buffet. People are more likely to overeat at a buffet just because of the availability of food. And then after food has entered your GI tract, there's different stimuli that occur that can cause you to feel full and stop eating. Food generally stays within the stomach for about 4 hours, and after that time, most of the food has passed into the small intestine. Everybody obviously has different rates of digestion, but around 4 hours, many people will start to kind of feel hungry again after a meal. This obviously depends on meal type as well. So certain meals are more satiating than others, and I already alluded to this point. Of all of the nutrients, protein is the most satiating nutrient. So if you eat meals that are protein rich, you tend to stay full longer and you tend to get hungry less often. Other foods that are very satiating include complex carbs and fibers. Fibers can have physical volume, and fibers are slow to empty from your stomach. And remember, stomach being empty is one of the cues to hunger. So in that regard, fiber and complex carbs can be satiating as well. Fat, while it may taste good and be found in many foods, is one of the least satiating nutrients. And so when people consume high-fat meals, say French fries, for example, which are primarily fat, they're often hungry very soon after. Fat can contribute a lot of calories, but not a lot of volume to the food. And volume of the food can influence whether you're going to get hungry or not, or whether you're going to feel satiated or not. So if we look at this 1 cup of peanuts and 1 cup of popcorn, both of them will fill the same volume in your stomach, but the 1 cup of peanuts has 837 calories versus the 55 in the popcorn. So it has way more calories and could contribute to weight gain. If you look at the same calorie sizes, 100 calories of popcorn versus 100 calories of peanuts, you're more likely to feel satiated after 100 calories of popcorn because it's going to physically fill the stomach and some of those stretch receptors are going to be triggered versus the small dish of 100 calories of peanuts. The hypothalamus I've already mentioned, but the hypothalamus is the main center in your brain that it is involved in hunger regulation. And there are many hormones produced when you eat, as well as when you're hungry, that send signals to the hypothalamus that are translated into chemical messages. So leptin, for example, is considered a hormone that suppresses appetite. And it will send a signal to the brain. Ghrelin is considered a hunger hormone, and so it tells us that we're hungry as we get closer to meal times. Insulin is secreted after we eat carbohydrates, and insulin acts to suppress appetite. And then PPY is a hormone that's secreted and counterregulates ghrelin, so it has the opposite effect of ghrelin and can reduce appetite. Neuropeptide Y. So this is a chemical produced in the brain. It stimulates appetite, diminishes energy expenditure, and increases fat. And it has the letter Y, not the word WHY, but I think of this as why am I always hungry? This will make you always hungry. It will cause you to eat a lot of carbs, so candies, ice cream, sugar sweetened beverages, etc., and you will not feel full and you will gain weight. So neuropeptide Y causes hunger. Energy output. So energy output occurs in three main ways. And so once we eat foods, that energy has to go somewhere. And so it can be diverted into our basal metabolism, which I'm going to talk about, the thermic effect of food, and physical activities. You can see that thermic effect of food is relatively stable at 10% of our calories. Basal metabolism is slightly variable between 50 and 65%, and physical activity between 30 to 50%. It is possible for physical activity to be lower. It's also possible for physical activity to be higher, but you would need a pretty high extreme amount of exercise to exceed 50% of your calories burned just from physical activity alone. So basal metabolism. Basal metabolism is the biggest contributor to our calories burned. And so in the beginning of this lecture, I discussed that if you lose weight rapidly, your metabolism slows down. And when I talked about your metabolism, what I was referring to is your basal metabolic rate. If you lose weight rapidly, your body will think you're starving. And in order to conserve energy or calories, your basal metabolic rate will slow, meaning the amount of calories that you use every day will decrease. Basal metabolic rate represents the amount of calories used for day-to-day activities. And in theory, basal metabolic rate would be measured resting after sleep. So you would be sleeping 12 hours, laying down in a bed, and then basal metabolic rate could be measured indirectly by looking at oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. Basal metabolic rate includes energy used for basic things like breathing, heart rate, bone marrow formation, red blood cell formation, immune cell formation, just our basic anabolic and catabolic reactions, urea excretion, urine excretion, stool, etc. So basal metabolic rate is kind of just our baseline or underlying energy needs just to literally sustain life and do all the functions that humans do. Basal metabolic rate can vary based on many factors, and I have these factors coming up on the next page. So there are certain factors that increase basal metabolic rate and certain factors that decrease basal metabolic rate. In general, age slows basal metabolic rate, and so infants are actually some of the highest metabolizers, meaning infants burn more calories than any other age group because they're growing so rapidly. Height can affect basal metabolic rate. Growth states increase basal metabolic rate. The more muscle you have increases basal metabolic rate. So this is another reason that exercise and muscle building activities can contribute to stable weight or weight loss. Exercise will build muscle, and people with higher percentage of muscle will burn more calories on a day-to-day basis than people with higher percentages of fat. Fasting will lower metabolic rate. Malnutrition will lower it. Different thyroid conditions can either speed up or slow it down. Smoking increases it. Originally, smoking was a strategy for weight loss. Hopefully nobody is using that strategy anymore, as smoking has so many adverse health effects that weight will be like the least of your worries. Caffeine can very, very slightly increase basal metabolic rate. Chronic users don't really see much of an effect. And sleep can decrease basal metabolic rate. The next contributor to our energy expenditure is something called thermic effect of food. And thermic effect of food is literally the calories needed to digest the food and process the food, absorb the food, transport the food, store, etc. So certain foods require different amounts of energy to break down. On average, all foods require 10%. However, certain foods require different percentages. Carbs, for example, require 5 to 10% of your energy expenditure. Fats are very easy for us to break down. They require 0 to 20%, 0 to 5% of our energy expenditure. Protein requires 20 to 30% of our energy expenditure, and alcohol requires 15 to 20% of your energy expenditure. So in this way, you could see that if people are eating very high fat diets, a very small percent of their energy expenditure is actually going to absorb, metabolize, process that fat, where if people are eating diets that are higher in protein, a more significant chunk of their calories are going to break down that protein. So in some senses, protein is more work for our bodies to metabolize and process than fat or carbohydrates are. This is, again, the same pie chart representing the different contributors to our energy expenditure. So we've talked about basal metabolic rate, we've talked about thermic effect of food, and now we'll talk about energy expenditure or physical activity. Physical activity can vary from person to person. It's possible that a sedentary person only, walking up, using the bathroom, going to the kitchen, may just use 10 to 20% of their calories for those activities. Where somebody who's going to the gym, training for an event, a professional athlete, may use 50% or more of their energy expenditure towards those activities. So healthy body weight. There are many definitions for healthy body weight, and unfortunately, I feel that these definitions are a little bit broad, and I feel that sometimes people get concerned if they don't fall under a category of healthy body weight, and instead they fall outside of a category. But each person is different, and so what is a healthy body weight for you might not necessarily be as healthy of a body weight for somebody else. But we do have some general guidelines to go off of. Healthy body weight is a weight that will allow us to sustain all of our metabolic functions, continue to grow, reproduce, fight off infection, etc. And so it's not based on, how beautiful we are, or if we're apple-shaped or hourglass-shaped, etc. It's more based on health. BMI is one of our current ways to assess body weight, but really BMI looks at body mass. So BMI looks at total weight of a person divided by the height of that person in meters squared. And height in meters squared really represents body area. So it's weight of a person per body area. And the thing with BMI is it only looks at weight. It does not look at body composition. So BMI cannot tell you if you are 90% fat or 90% lean or 60% water. It only tells you an entire value for your weight. So it does not tell us anything about body composition. And hopefully you've realized by now that body composition is very important for health. And certain body composition profiles are more health promoting than others. That being said, how do we calculate BMI? We can convert our weight from pounds to kilograms. So we can do that by dividing our weight in pounds by 2.2. We can also convert our height in feet and inches into our height in centimeters and then our height in meters squared. So in every inch, there are 2.54 centimeters. So for example, if you were 66 inches tall, or 5 foot 6 inches, you would multiply 66 by 2.54 to find out your height in centimeters. There are 100 centimeters in a meter, so you would divide this number by 100 to find out your height in meters, and then you would multiply the meters by themselves or square the meters using the calculator. This says, please calculate your BMI, turn it in for class participation points. Of course, I wouldn't judge you, but since this is online, you guys are not going to have to do that. But I would recommend that you do try calculating it on your own. There are also apps available and online BMI calculators that you can use. But being able to calculate a BMI for a hypothetical person would be a fair question for a quiz or midterm exam. You can also use BMI charts to estimate your BMI. So the way that these charts work is you have height on the left side and weight on the top side. And so what you're going to do is you're going to find your height, which I happen to be 5'6", and then you're going to scroll over to find your weight. And I'm about 124 pounds. So then I look up here and I find that my BMI is 20. The yellow category of BMI represents underweight. This blue represents normal. Pink represents overweight. And then white represents obese. So again, I want you to do this with a grain of salt. And remember that BMI is just a calculation and the number does not represent body composition. So for example, my fiance is by these calculations obese. And when you look at him, you would absolutely not think he's obese, but he happens to not be extremely tall. He's the same height as me, he's 5'6". However, he was weighing close to 190 pounds because he's very, very muscular. He mountain bikes, he rock climbs, he runs ultramarathons. So he's just a very kind of thick guy, and all of his thickness is muscle. It's not fat. But from a BMI standpoint, he looks obese, or he comes out as being calculated as obese. So do remember that these are just numbers, but these are often how standards are created. And so we're going to see this next chart, but here we have a pie graph, and it outlines the different ranges for BMI classifications, as well as what percent of the American population falls within each of these ranges. So starting at the bottom, or the far right, we have underweight, and a BMI less than 18.5 represents underweight. A very small portion of the population in the United States is underweight. If we looked at this for other countries, we might see a much higher percent, especially countries experiencing famines or malnutrition. Next, we have healthy weight, which is going counterclockwise to the left. And healthy weight is a BMI between 18.5 to 24.9. You can see this represents close to a third of the pie chart, so only 1/3 of Americans fall within this healthy BMI. Again, moving counterclockwise, we see overweight on the left, and overweight represents the largest proportion of the population with a BMI between 25 to 29.9, and then obesity, a BMI 30 to 39.9, and then extreme obesity with a BMI over 40. So if you consider people who are either overweight, obese, or suffering from extreme obesity, it's actually more than 2/3 of the population. And obesity trends have been growing significantly over the years. So what makes up the weight of our bodies? I already said BMI uses a strict weight number and doesn't look at body composition. So in that weight number, we have muscle, we have fat, we have organs, we have fluid, we have bone, we have joints, tendons, ligaments, hair, etc. And so that's all of our weight. BMI doesn't tell us anything about that. Body fat percentage. There are ideal body fat percentages, or what's considered normal body fat percentages, for males and females of different age groups. And you can look at what's considered ideal, which is in the center column, versus what the actual is. You can see for all ages and genders, we are over our ideal body fatness in the United States, which should not be a surprise. as we considered that 2/3 of Americans are either overweight or obese. So this is kind of indicating that that overweight or obesity does likely somewhat correlate with actual body fatness versus just a number on a scale. There are definitely exceptions to this chart. And so females who are pregnant or trying to get pregnant may have higher percentages of body fatness. Certain ethnicities have higher percentages of body fatness as an adaptation to different conditions that they traditionally endured. So such as Alaska Natives, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders may have higher percentages of body fat. Certain people may have lower percentages of body fat. So maybe you have a competitive athlete and they may not have as high of a level of body fat as what's considered ideal, but that's normal for them. Fat distribution. Not only does the percent of fat in the body, but also the location of the fat in the body is important to dictating our health. So fat that surrounds the organs is much more harmful than fat that surrounds other tissues, and specifically like the hips and thighs. So fat that surrounds our stomach, our liver, our kidneys, our intestines, our heart even, is considered central obesity. And people who have this central obesity are considered to have apple shapes. And this type of fat actually secretes multiple hormones, which can directly influence organ function and cause inflammation. Fat that's around the hips and thighs also can excrete hormones, but since there's no organs there, the hormones don't necessarily have as damaging as an effect, and it seems to be less harmful. So pear-shaped fat accumulation is less harmful than apple-shaped fat accumulation, and this is independent of BMI. So you could see central adiposity or central fatness even in somebody who has a normal BMI. This is kind of the diagram showing the apple-shaped versus the pear-shaped. Apples are referred to as android shape and pears are referred to as gynoid shape. And having a higher apple shape or a bigger waist circumference does indicate risk for chronic diseases such as increased risk of high blood pressure, increased risk of diabetes, specifically type 2, increased risk of heart disease, potential increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, etc. And so we can look at the shape of a person and we can measure the shape of a person by their waist circumference. So if a man has a waist that is bigger than 40 inches around, or a woman has a waist that is bigger than 35 inches around, it indicates that they're at significant metabolic risks due to the accumulation of central fat. So how is body fat measured? I just showed a picture of them measuring the waist circumference. This doesn't specifically measure body fat, but it's an indirect measure. We have additional indirect measures as well, and so we'll be seeing them on the next page. On the top left is something called skin folds measurements, and they use a device called a caliper to pinch different skin folds around the body. There's multiple sites, and depending on the skin folds thicknesses, they can enter those into an equation and compare them to reference standards and get an indirect estimate of body fatness. Next is hydrodensitometry, and this actually weighs a person underwater. So you are in a swimsuit in a tank just like this. You have to expel all your air, blow out all your breath, and go underwater for approximately 5 seconds, at which time the water that's displaced is measured, as well as your body is weighed. And then this does go into equations to estimate body composition. Bioelectrical impedance can be done. This particular picture is slightly odd and not a typical scenario that I've seen. So in the bottom left, this woman has electrical tape hooked up to her hand and her foot, creating a current through her body, and that current is measured. And so The current will find resistance if it's hitting, a protein, bone, etc., fat. And so you can measure how much resistance the current hits, and it's an indirect measure of body fat percent. Usually you don't have a scenario where it's a hand and a foot connected. Usually you are standing on a scale, perhaps with 2 feet, bare feet. We have those inside Allan Hancock in the classroom. Or perhaps you're holding a handheld device that is attached to both hands. In the upper right, we have air displacement, or what's called a bod pod, and you can sit in a chamber and it will determine how much air your body has displaced. And then they have something called DEXA scans, or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, and this will actually give you a pictogram or a picture of kind of the differences in fat, muscle, bone, etc. And then waist circumference I already talked about as being an indirect measure. I've talked a little bit about some of the health risks of overweight. I did not discuss sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is when you actually stop breathing during your sleep, and it could be just for a few seconds. It could be up to a minute. This causes significantly disrupted sleep patterns, which can further lead to obesity and put you at risk for chronic disease. Obesity and overweight also have higher risks of high cholesterol, high triglycerides. Certain cancers are associated with overweight and obesity. Worsening of certain arthritises are associated with overweight and obesity. Decreased quality of life, sexual dysfunction, but difficulty with respiration, many other things. Underweight also has significant risks, so it's not good to be too underweight or too overweight. If we're too underweight, we don't have those protein stores in our body or fat stores to pull from in cases of caloric restriction, and we don't have enough fat to produce hormones. We can have menstrual irregularities, osteoporosis, because remember, proteins build up the bone fractures, etc. BMI and mortality is the relationship between BMI and mortality is what's referred to as a J-shaped or U-shaped curve. It really is more kind of J than U, or you could say the U is shifted to the left. And so what this is showing is that with very, very low BMI, the far left is a BMI of 15, you have higher rates of mortality. As BMI increases to about 23-ish in this particular diagram, the rates of mortality are at the lowest. They stay low for a little while, and then beyond 25, as BMI increases, the rates of mortality also increase. So this is depicting that having too low or too high of a BMI are both associated with increased mortality. For example, a BMI 30 to 35 is associated with 3 years shorter lifespan, and a BMI over 40 is associated with approximately 10 years shorter lifespan, which is the same equivalent as smoking a pack of cigarettes every day. Okay, moving a little bit away from energy balance, but not exactly away from it, because eating disorders definitely affect energy balance. We're going to very, very, very briefly touch upon some more commonly diagnosed eating disorders. Anorexia nervosa affects approximately 1% of women and 3% or 0.3% of men. Bulimia may affect 1.5% of women and 0.5% of men. Binge-eating disorder is more common. The latest statistics I had were 3.5% of women, 2% of men. I would guess it's actually higher than that. You also have to take into consideration that these disorders are only going to be diagnosed if a person needs medical assistance, is hospitalized, or if they are voluntarily sharing this information with their practitioner, such as their primary doctor or their psychiatrist. So, eating disorders and the female athlete triad. The female athlete triad is actually kind of an older term that they used to use to discuss some of the characteristics, symptoms, and signs of eating disorders that at the time they used this term were primarily seen in females. Females with eating disorders tend to be athletes. They tend to be athletes that are involved in sports where body image is very important, or weight to height ratio, weight to strength ratio is very important. And so you often see a combination of over-exercising with restrictive nutrients. This causes some of these females to have very, very low body fat percentage. And in females, we need approximately 20% or higher body fat at least to sustain a normal menstrual cycle, produce the hormones of reproduction, etc. And so often in these female athletes, we would see extreme exercising, loss of body weight, dieting, and then amenorrhea, which is lack of a period. If this dieting continued past the point, where it became very serious, you may see osteoporosis. Osteoporosis could happen when there's inadequate calcium intakes, inadequate vitamin D, inadequate protein, inadequate energy. So you see this kind of combination sometimes in female athletes. To be gender inclusive, they have rephrased this term to REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. And this will include males as well. And so males obviously are not going to exhibit the same symptoms of females by missing their periods, but they can exhibit bone loss, they can exhibit fat loss, they can exhibit dieting, excessive exercising, etc. Anorexia nervosa. So anorexia literally means denial of appetite. And in patients with anorexia, they refuse to maintain a normal body weight. They often have very distorted body image, meaning they're very lean or underweight or normal weight, but they perceive themselves as being overweight. It's very common for them to have areas of the body that they're very unsatisfied with, such as maybe the fat around their hips or their thighs, where they continually critique these areas. To the point of perfection, which perfection is usually indicative of starvation. It's very common for people with anorexia to consume maybe 200 to 400 calories a day, maybe fast completely during the day, do some sort of interesting behaviors such as only having diet soda, chewing a lot of gum, only drinking water. And anorexia can be very dangerous. It can cause significant fat and muscle loss, even to the point of depleted immune function and respiratory failure. So anorexia can be deadly. At a certain percentage of body weight lost, anorexics will need hospitalization to have fluid replacement, caloric replacement, electrolyte stabilization, and supervised weight gain, as well as excessive psychological counseling. So if you're interested in learning more about eating disorders, my colleague Libby Parker actually teaches an entire class about them, and you can take it from her. Treatment of anorexia. Really, treatment of any of these eating disorders involves a multidisciplinary approach. And what multidisciplinary means is multiple team members. So you're not just going to have a doctor or dietitian, you're going to have everybody involved, even a social worker perhaps. You're going to work on resolving issues. A lot of times anorexia is not about the food at all, and instead about some underlying psychological issues, body image issues, self-esteem issues. So it's rebuilding those healthy relationships with food by working on these underlying problems. Bulimia. Bulimia is an eating disorder characterized by binges, which are excessive calorie consumption sessions, followed by purging. And purging could include vomiting, it could include use of laxatives, it could also include excessive exercise, diuretics, fasting. You don't actually usually see fasting as a purge. That's not as typical as the other types of purges. But people who are bulimic tend to eat a lot in one sitting. They overeat. They eat beyond the point of feeling full. Often they have adverse feelings related to this activity. So then they feel that they need to purge, get the food out of their system, and they do. While anorexics are generally normal weight to severely underweight, bulimics can be normal weight to even overweight because these compensation methods, they don't work. So for example, vomiting, if you vomit after eating a meal, you've actually already absorbed the majority of the foods in that meal. If you use laxatives, many laxatives work in the large intestine, and by the time food gets to the large intestine, the majority of food has been digested and absorbed, meaning all of the calories have been digested and absorbed, or the majority of them. As far as excessive exercise goes, the amount of time required to burn the amount consumed in some of these binges is just astronomical. And so there literally isn't enough time in a single day to compensate by exercise for many of these people. Binge eating. So binge eating and restrictive eating, restrictive dieting can be a vicious cycle. Often people will have negative self-perceptions. Maybe they have negative self-esteem. That self-esteem might be due to just qualities about themselves, personality qualities, educational qualities. Maybe they've done poorly at their job, or it may be due exactly to their body image, their body shape, their body size. This can cause them to restrict their eating so that they improve that body image or body size. When they restrict their eating, eventually restrictions in eating are generally not sustainable. And so often a purge will follow, or a binge. I meant a binge, not a purge. After they binge, they usually have feels of guilt or feelings that they've messed up this diet that they were on. And so they purge to try to fix it, which then potentially they feel guilty about purging. And it just continues. So many people who suffer from eating disorders will require treatment, at least at some level, to help them move through the recovery process. Diet strategies for combating bulimia. You can read through some of these on your own. And again, if you're more interested, you can take a whole entire class about this. And then binge eating disorder. So unlike bulimia, binge eating disorder is a type of eating disorder where people do binge, meaning eating excessive amounts of food, more than what would be normal for one setting. However, they don't compensate for these binges by purging. So you don't see the vomiting, you don't see the laxative use, you don't see the excessive exercise. And because there's no compensation, generally speaking, people with binge eating disorder tend to be overweight or even potentially obese because they're just consuming calories. Tips for combating eating disorders can be seen here. And again, it's very, very individualized, multidisciplinary type of treatment. So it's important that you work with each client on a case-by-case basis. And now I believe we're going to move to our quiz. So a person who consistently consumes 1,700 calories a day and spends or expends 2,200 calories a day for a month would be expected to, wow, this is complicated. So I'm going to show you what you would do here. What you would do here is you would say 2,200 calories minus 1,700 calories is a 500 calorie deficit. So they're using 500 calories more than they're intaking. In the average month, there are 30 days. So you're going to multiply 30 by 500. And you're going to get 15,000, I believe 15,000. If I did this right, I'll just double check on my calculator. So 30 times 500, 15,000. Remember that there were, remember that there were 3,500 calories approximately in each pound of weight gained or lost. So you're going to take this 15,000 and divide it by 3,500, and this is going to give you 4.28. And so this person, since they're consuming less calories than they're burning, they would lose on average 4.28, which would be answer number C. So that's how you would solve that problem. Now I need to attempt to clear this, and it's going to get mad at me. So, okay, next. The brain chemical neuropeptide Y is known specifically to enhance the craving for carbohydrates. Remember, why am I still hungry? Why do I keep eating? It's because I'm eating carbs and those are not satiating. So why am I still hungry? The psychological desire to eat that accompanies the sight, smell, or thought of food is known as, hopefully you guys said appetite. A person watching television after dinner reaches for a snack during a commercial in response to external cues. So that commercial is externally influencing them to be hungry even when they wouldn't physiologically be hungry. The largest component of energy expenditure is basal metabolism. The major factor affecting basal metabolic rate is body composition. The thermic effect of an 800 calorie meal is about, hopefully you remember that thermic effect of food is about 10% of the calories consumed. So if you were to multiply this by 10% or 0.1, you would get 80 calories. So in every 800 calorie meal, approximately 80 of those calories are going just to break down, digest, absorb, etc., the food. For health's sake, a person with a BMI of 21 might want to, hopefully you said maintain weight, because a BMI of 21 falls within the healthy range. Which of the following reflects height and weight? Body mass index, central obesity, waist circumference, or body composition? Hopefully you said BMI. Which of the following increases disease risks? Hopefully you said D. All right, good job, and I'll see you next time.